and we're going to kind of talk about a few procedural items that need to be discussed as we get into the second grading period. First of all, even if you are in the live session in person, you need to be completing the exit tickets each day. Okay, that kind of confirms your attendance and your participation from a day-to-day basis. So looking back on yesterday's exit ticket that related to the two pieces of media, the one that you watched and then the excerpt from the podcast, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people that I have yet to receive that completed from. And so you're going to need to go into yesterday's course page and get that done. And exit tickets are not going to be something that takes you a really long time to complete, but it is something that I need to help verify attendance. And so that is something that is a big deal. So again, if you're just joining us, we're talking about procedural items of when you are in a class setting, even in an online setting, and we are in a situation where we have an exit ticket that we have to complete. That exit ticket is to be done. You have basically a 24-hour window, but we're basically at the point right now where I'm still missing a good portion of them from I'll have about 8 that I have not received. So please get those done from yesterday as quickly as you can. A couple things that relate to just accessibility on the Canvas page that has changed. For our section, I have put a button here at the top of the week page view that says list of course assignments. And I'm trying to stay consistent in terms of what we're doing in terms of assignments that you all in the online section are doing versus those that are doing the hybrid in person and then remote. So that consistency will be the same moving forward. And if there is a change, obviously I will make sure that's clear. But if you're ever in a situation where you can't find an assignment from the grading period that is marked missing or you forgot to complete, if you go to list of course assignments and you click on that button, it's going to take you to the module for this grading period. I've already locked or unpublished the grading period 1 because it's over. And so you would have a situation here where, vocabulary, which I know that we are not going to assess over right now, and then the Boston Massacre assignment from last week, which has been entered into Skyward, and anything that was not turned in is marked as 0 and missing. You would be able to access that and know where it is, and then obviously submit it through Notability. So that's a little bit of help with accessibility as if you're having trouble, because I don't want people to have to try to go to the archive pages and backtrack, all that. So that'll make things a little bit easier. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about, review some of the themes that we talked about yesterday, and then look at what Britain's response is going to be to the Boston Tea Party, which is obviously a very famed event in American history that we kind of learned more about in terms of what the true motives were yesterday. So we're going to kind of just review a few concepts with that, and then we're going to talk about what are called the intolerable acts, also known as the coercive acts. And we're going to look at a reflective, or in a reflective way, kind of reviewing all the cause and effects up to this point of the American Revolution. Okay. And so, one of the things that we've seen thus far with the Boston Tea Party is that it's largely, a situation that arises much more for reasons about protecting an economic interest rather than purely about being unhappy with British policies. Okay. And so it all goes back to the fact that a British company is dealing with a severe surplus. And if you have a surplus, that means you have way too much product and you're really have no way to sell it. Because if you have too much of something, then obviously the demand for that has dropped. So this is kind of like an economic policy of supply and demand. Too much of a product leads to a surplus, the demand goes down, and then the price goes down, which means you can't sell it for what the normal price would be. And this British East India Company, which imports tea from Asia, primarily, India and China, they can't sell the tea in America. They're having difficulty that. And this company would sell tea to all different British colonies, but in America specifically, they're not able to sell it. All right. And that's due primarily to the fact that the cost is so much lower to buy this smuggled tea that, American merchants are getting from the Netherlands, from the Dutch. All right. And just so you know, Britain is fully aware that smuggling is going on. They just don't know how to enforce the stop of it, because one of the things the video clip yesterday pointed out was that the coastline of America is so broad and vast that you can't put British vessels completely along the eastern portion of North America, because that would be very costly and probably ineffective. And you could still figure out ways for the colonies to figure out an ability to smuggle goods in. Like the podcast excerpt talked about the fact that a lot of times smuggled tea would be dropped off in Plymouth, which is just south of Boston, and then they would load it onto wagons and take it into Boston, and there was no way to fully detect the difference between the smuggled tea and the British tea. All right. So what Britain is going to do is Britain is going to make a deal with this company to basically have them ship it primarily to America and work with intermediaries or middlemen that are going to sell it to the colonies, people who are loyal to Britain and people who are going to have a job of doing that. Now, the problem is that there's still going to be a tax on the tea. It's a tea act. The tea act is centered around you're still taxing tea, but the price of tea is going to be so much lower that it's really going to compete with people living in the colonies that are smuggling tea and then trying to sell that smuggled tea. Okay. And the podcast mentioned the name John Hancock, who goes on to become the president of the Continental Congress. He's the first person to sign the Declaration of Independence. His is that very fancy, recognizable, large signature at the bottom of the Declaration. He's a very well-known, very influential figure as a representative of the Assembly of Massachusetts. But his wealth comes from smuggling tea. And so there's several people just like him that they're going to lose business if Britain is able to undersell at a lower price. And so the reaction to the Tea Act comes from two different directions. The first reaction is going to be a principle of Britain's making another law without our consent, which is taxation without representation. Okay. And, we saw that argument made in that document that we looked at, which was the Stamp Act Congress, where the colonial leaders, the representatives, affirmed or stated that Britain can't make laws in the colonies without the colonial consent. Okay. Which is an old English idea. It's nothing new there. All right. The second school of thought here is the reaction is going to be concerned because of those who are smugglers are going to lose business. All right. So Britain's proposal is the tax is going to be so cheap that the colonists will buy it. The colonial merchants, many of which are smugglers, obviously, do not want to have a competition in place and need to do something to rid the colony of this new supply of tea that could compete with their kind of overall control of the business of selling tea in the colonies. I'm not saying it's a monopoly where they have complete control, but obviously they don't want to lose business, okay? Because the demand for tea is not going to go down. Tea contains caffeine, caffeine's addictive, and it's something that is commonplace in the colonies because it's one of those characteristics that were brought over because obviously people in Britain have been drinking tea for centuries. So How do you get rid of your competition? Well, you destroy the tea. So when tea shipments come in, Sons of Liberty members, many of which who are at the same time smugglers, will disguise themselves as Mohawk Indians. Mohawk was one of the tribes in the region in western Massachusetts. And they're going to go on board and they're going to dump the tea into Boston Harbor. And the value is going to be more than $1 million. You're talking about 342 chests of tea. So for the smugglers, this is a victory because they have eliminated their competition in the, for vying for the business of colonists who want to buy tea. All right. So this is kind of a old, illustration to represent what took place. It's a vintage piece because if you look here at the bottom, Boston, you have that very Old English S that is there. So this dates to the period of the American Revolution. But it's a victory. We've stamped out British tyranny. We've stamped out British competition, and the colonial smugglers are still in business because, as the podcast pointed out, the concern is that the legal tea was now going to be as cheap as the illegal tea. Okay. So up until this point, we've had a lot of back and forth reaction from what the British are doing to what the colonists are doing to what the British are doing. And so we're going to lead up into how the British are going to respond to the Boston Tea Party. Okay. So let's go back to the fact that everything in this time period, and really everything in American history, is based on cause and effect. Okay. So we have Britain winning the war, doubling their land at a price because their economy is now in shambles. And then the effect would be that the colonies are expected to help pay the cost of the war or the cost of the defense. Okay. So what does Britain do? They implement new laws, a tax on sugar, the stamp tax, obviously, on paper, which leads to widespread rebellion, boycotting, the Stamp Act Congress convening concerning about their rights, the rebelling against the taxes in general, including using violence and intimidation, which leads to the Stamp Act being repealed. Repealed means to remove. But we also know that Britain is not going to just wave the white flag and give in to defeat. Their policy is they're going to double down. And what that means is that they're going to reinforce their control over the colonies. So they want to make it very clear to the colonies that they're not gaining any kind of sovereignty or independent ability to govern themselves at this time, because Britain does not want to give the colonies any credit for the victory, and they don't want the colonies to think that this is a step towards more autonomy and more freedom. Okay. So they declare, they issue the declaratory law. Britain has full control of the colonies to declare laws at any time. They issue the Quartering Act, which means that British troops will be housed and provided housing in the colonies. They're going to pass the Townshend Acts, which is going to tax imported goods like lead, glass, tea, paint, paper. Okay. And we obviously know that there's colonial reaction to that, which is very negative, because that leads to widespread violence and tension, which ultimately culminates into the Boston Massacre. 5 dead by the hands of British soldiers, and the Townshend Act is repealed. Yes, I do know that is a typo. It should say accept, not accept. Obviously, apologize for that. And so Britain is going through this trial and error process. We try law, it's a failure. We try law, it's a failure. We try law, it's a failure. And then we have this situation with the Tea Act, which leads to the Boston Tea Party, smugglers wanting to protect their ability to sell laws, which leads us into early 1774, January, where Parliament and the approval from the King issues what they call the Coercive Acts, which became known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. Okay? And these are going to be punitive laws. Okay? So let's take a look at what they are. Now, let's pause here for a moment and take a look at this date here, because, we're in a situation now where we're getting very close to the brink of independence, to the point of no return. As years passed, More and more colonists are concerned about the relationship with Britain. More and more colonists are seeing the idea of as an independent nation a reality. But there's still a lot of concern about that, because you can't just plead with Britain and ask for, separation or independence and be granted that, because Britain's invested too much time, too much money, and too much hardship to just give up these colonies that are extreme value. There are an extreme value to them. And ultimately, one of the things that's looming in the back of people's minds is a war is going to be inevitable to win independence. But that means that a group of colonies that have nothing more than a militia, no standing army, no navy, would have to compete against the greatest military force on earth. And that's a very difficult task to become a realistic idea. And that's ultimately the retaliation from Britain is ultimately one of the biggest things that a lot of people fear, even if they have the idea of independence in their mind as, it would definitely be a possibility. I mean, it's not as if, folks, that colonies around the world are, winning independence from Britain left and right. It's not happening. This is a time of monarchy where monarchies are not overthrown. Okay. And so this is direct reaction to the actions that were taking place in Boston with the Tea Act. Okay. Probably the one that was going to be focusing the most on Massachusetts and specifically Boston was that there was going to be a naval blockade on the harbor. Boston is the most profitable harbor in the colonies, for the colonies in terms of trading goods. And if it's closed by way of a blockade, that's a big problem. Okay. And the idea is that until the tea was paid for, there wasn't going to be any let up on this blockade. All right. So there's a series of parts to this that are a part of this. It's not just a singular action, but Britain's patience with the colonies is pretty much over. They're not willing to appease the colonies. They're not willing to accept the colonies' frustrations. Basically, the attitude from the king is you need to shape up, get in line, reestablish yourself and your loyalty to the king, and everything will be fine. And a lot of people are beyond that. They're past that. Okay. The second thing is that there's a revision in the Quartering Act that mentioned more now about specific supplies and food being provided for the soldiers. Now, Quartering Acts have been in place for numerous years. It originated in 1765. It didn't mean that, every single troop or every single soldier in the colony, went up to a door, knocked on the door and presented a piece of paper and says, looks like I'm living here now. There was barracks that, the cost of providing military barracks was on the colonies. Some soldiers lived in barns or slept in barns, inns and taverns. There's different things, but the cost was placed on the colonies in forms of taxes. Okay. But you did have situations where soldiers were living in people's homes. And that could be a little bit interesting, obviously. Okay. Next, we have Thomas Hutchinson, the elected governor of Massachusetts, being relieved of his responsibility and replaced with Gage. Basically, the king felt that Thomas Hutchinson had lost control of the colony, had no way to ultimately restore order. And I know we so often talk about Massachusetts and Boston kind of being the central hub of revolution. And really it is, because you go back to, where does the anger toward the Stamp Act kind of originate in many ways? It's Boston. And then you have the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. The first shots of the war are fired in Lexington and Concord, which is just 10, 12 miles west of Boston. So it's no coincidence here, okay? But if you think about it, Thomas Gage is going to be nothing more than a yes man, meaning he's going to follow his orders to a T that are given to him by the king. He's going to be loyal to the king, all right? And then lastly, we have, what's going on here? I can't get there we go. Lastly, we have, and there's a nice portrait of King George III. Lastly, we have a situation where if you were accused of a crime in the colonies as a soldier, manslaughter, murder, whatever the charge may be, you're going to have you're going to have your trial in Britain and not in the colonies. And doing the hand raising thing, can anybody tell me why soldiers would no longer have their trial in the colonies and would rather they would have them in England or Britain? Why would that change occur? Verl?
Because Britain's court would be biased towards them instead of towards the colonists.
Yeah, bias or motivation has a lot to do with this, because I think it's fair to say that a trial would be fairer, and I'm putting that in air quotes, in Britain. And by 1774, I don't think that any British soldier who is very much hated at this point and reviled by the majority of the population could get a fair trial in a colonial court. It's 4 years is a big difference from, it's a long time from John Adams stepping up and representing the soldiers accused of the Boston Massacre. That obviously led to a lot of frustration and anger. It's hard to say that the colonial courts would not. How do you find a jury that's not going to be unbiased? It's a very difficult proposition here. So it leads us to a very major crossroads here in the American Revolution. All right. Britain has essentially given a list of non-negotiables. Britain's patience with the colonies is over. They're not willing to accept, any of the complaints or the concerns from the colonies up to this point. The argument has been essentially the same from King George III. You are to be a loyal subject of mine, and that's the way it is. Okay. But this is important, and we need to think about this in terms of what's next. So we're going to go back to the course page here for today. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at the exit ticket. And again, the exit tickets need to be completed each day to help verify your attendance. So let's take a look at the exit ticket. I think this is a really good question. It says, based on what you have learned today about the Tea Act, Boston Tea Party, and the Intolerable Acts, which is what we just went over, the British response to the Boston Tea Party, predict, this is a level 4 skill, predict the reaction by the colonies of the Intolerable Acts. So how are colonists going to react? And I want you to look at it through the eyes or the lenses of two different people, two different persons. One would be a regular colonist, Joe Schmo from Maryland or Billy Bob from Georgia. And the second group is going to be a colonial representative. Now, let me clarify what this means. If you are a colonial representative of Massachusetts or Rhode Island or Virginia, you are someone that was elected and voted into that position by citizens and people in your colony. You were not appointed to that position by Britain. You were elected to that position by your peers. And so we need to see, how would a regular colonist react and how would a representative of a colony react? And then why? Why do you feel that the response that you have chosen would be that way? What I don't want you to do is to say, well, both groups are going to be mad because it's unfair. Done. That's not a good answer. You have to think about, at this point, with everything that's been going on, what is the reaction going to be from a regular colonist and what is the reaction going to be from a representative or a spokesperson of the people? Because representatives of a colony, just like representatives of a state, speak on behalf of their population, of that group, of that colony or state. Okay. Now it says 2 to 3 sentences plus. I would say you're going to need to do at least 3 sentences because you also need to explain the reasoning why. You can reflect back on prior circumstances, but really this is a prediction. You're hypothesizing what is going to happen because we've seen, again, the cause and effect. The cause of the Tea Act, the effects of the Tea Act, the causes of the Boston Tea Party, the effects of the Tea Party with the Intolerable Acts. What is going to be the effects of Britain issuing these Intolerable Acts in the colonies? Okay. Does anybody have any questions or need me to clarify something on what I'm asking here? Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about this tomorrow, but we are going to look at how the colonies do react to this and what it means moving forward. Because obviously we know that if you obviously know that the Declaration of Independence was written in 1776, declaring the United States of America as a separate sovereign country, not a, 2 years from, 1774 is when the Intolerable Acts were issued. It's only 2 years. So something has to give or something drastically has to change because, something's going to happen. We obviously know that. Okay. If there are no questions, I'm going to stop recording.